The tray of mulled cider trembled in my hands, the glasses clinking like faint bells as I stood frozen in the hallway of our cedar-shingled cottage in Burlington, Vermont. The living room glowed with the amber flicker of Christmas lights strung across the mantel, but their warmth never reached me. My husband, Julian, let out a sharp, slicing laugh that cut through the hum of holiday chatter drifting from the next room. "She'll shatter when she sees those papers," he told his best friend, Marcus, whose smug chuckle slithered after, low and oily. Women like her always do. My heart slammed against my ribs, my breath caught like a stone in my throat, and the world tilted on its axis. 5 days before Christmas, and they were betting on my collapse. If you've ever felt your own home-turned traitor, thank you for being here. If you believe no one should feel small in their own space, hit subscribe. It's free and lifts others from silence to strength. Now, let's dive into this tale of betrayal, resilience, and triumph. A story that burns with unapologetic emotional punch, its raw intensity gripping your soul, its unfiltered heart striking hard with a visceral payoff that lingers. This didn't begin in that hallway. The cracks formed years earlier, hidden in the velvet folds of Julian's charm, his laughter a noose disguised as affection. A tax attorney with a grin that could sway clients into signing contracts they barely understood, he wielded words like daggers at our dinner parties. We'd host them in our dining room, with its oak table and mismatched chairs I'd painted sage green, the air thick with the scent of rosemary bread and candle wax. "I could walk away tomorrow, and Elise would be nothing," he'd say, his hand grazing my arm, his hazel eyes glinting with a warmth that never reached his voice. Guests, colleagues, neighbors, the occasional cousin, would laugh, their wine glasses catching the light, and I'd choke out a smile, my chest knotting tighter than a sailor's rope. Each chuckle from the table felt like a brick added to the wall closing me in. "He's just teasing," I told my sister, Lena, after she caught his venom at a Labor Day barbecue in our backyard, the air heavy with grilled vegetables and citronella. Julian had leaned across the picnic table, his voice light but barbed, saying, "Elise thinks she's an artist, but her paintings are more decorative, right?" Lena's eyes, fierce and gray as a winter storm, held mine. "He doesn't need to mean it, Elise. You're vanishing." Her words stung because they were true. I was fading, piece by piece, into the shadow of the wife Julian wanted, quiet, pliable, predictable. I stopped wearing my amethyst necklace, the one my mother gave me when I graduated college, after Julian smirked. "Trying to look expensive? It's not your style." I weighed every word before speaking, dreading the moment they'd spark a lecture on my flaws. He never yelled, never struck. His cruelty was sharper, cloaked in charm, delivered with a smile and a sip of his sparkling water. "Don't humiliate me at the firm's lunch, Elise. You're lucky I stay. Who else would want you?" Each barb landed softly, like a needle through silk, and I'd smile back, schooled to swallow the pain. I'd stand at the kitchen sink, scrubbing dishes, my reflection in the window showing a woman I barely recognized, eyes dull, shoulders hunched, lips pressed into a line to keep from breaking. Our cottage, with its creaking pine floors and bay windows overlooking Lake Champlain, became his theater. I stopped hosting poetry nights after he mocked my verses, too emotional, not clever enough. My painting easel gathered cobwebs in the attic, my texts to Lena went unanswered, and my world shrank to Julian's tempo, his moods, his limits, his thresholds. He craved control, subtle and cold as a January wind. When my father visited, his boots still dusted with soil from his garden, Julian loudly noted the unpolished silverware on the table. "Elise isn't exactly Martha Stewart," he'd chuckle, his voice warm enough to fool the room. I'd laugh too, but inside I was splintering, each jab carving away another piece of me. I told myself this was marriage, imperfect but steady, a compromise carved from years of shared history. He didn't disappear for weeks, didn't flaunt affairs like some husbands did. That was enough, wasn't it? I clung to that thought like a lifeline, repeating it as I folded his shirts, as I memorized his coffee order, black, no sugar, scalding hot, to avoid his size. But the truth gnawed at me, a quiet ache that grew louder with every passing month. Then came the firm's holiday gala at a Montpelier inn, its chandeliers casting diamond light across velvet drapes and polished floors. I wore a navy dress, the one I thought he liked, my hair pinned up to avoid his usual critique of trying too hard. 3 glasses of sparkling water in, Julian leaned close, his breath sharp with mint and bitterness. "You're just like them. Desperate, clinging, always needing more." The words landed like a slap, but I didn't flinch. My throat seized, my face burned, but I didn't ask why. I'd stopped asking long ago. At home, he slammed the study door, the sound echoing through the cottage like a gunshot. I poured him a glass of water, handed it with a honed smile, and said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands, "Maybe we should sign something, just in case. You're always joking about leaving. Let's make it real." He laughed, a raw, reckless sound that filled the study, its bookshelves lined with tax law journals and his framed degrees. He grabbed a legal pad from his desk, the same one he used to draft client proposals. "You think I need a post-nup to protect my tax forms?" he scoffed, scrawling his signature in his sharp, angular script. He tossed the pad aside, the pages fluttering like a wounded bird, and sank into his leather chair. "Notarize it if you're that paranoid." He was asleep by midnight, sprawled across the couch, his tie loosened, his phone glowing beside him. But I was awake, my mind racing, my heart pounding with something new, not fear, not anger, but a spark of resolve. By morning, I was at Lena's law office in Montpelier, a small brick building with a creaky radiator and the faint smell of coffee. She read the document, her brow creasing, her glasses slipping down her nose. "He signed this willingly?" she asked, her voice low, as if the paper might overhear. I nodded, my fingers twisting in my lap. She notarized it without another word, her stamp pressing into the page with a finality that made my breath catch. I locked the paper in a safe under my desk, labeled old receipts, and emailed a scan to a private account Lena had set up years ago, just in case. That night, I baked Julian's favorite rosemary focaccia, its scent filling the kitchen, laughed at his stories about a client's botched audit, and scrubbed the counters while he scrolled his phone. He didn't see the fire in my eyes, the shift from fear to reckoning, the quiet forging of a blade. Months bled into a silent rebellion. A plain notebook, its cover worn and gray, hid under my mattress, its pages a ledger of Julian's words, every jab, every dismissal, every time he came home at 2 a.m., smelling of cedar and gin. I wasn't scheming, not consciously, but I was building armor, piece by meticulous piece. At a firm cocktail party in Burlington, the air thick with cigar smoke and clinking glasses, he told a cluster of associates, "Elise's hobby is buying art supplies she never uses." Their laughter stung, but I slipped away, stared into the bathroom mirror, its edges fogged with steam, and hissed, "He thinks I'm brittle." I had been, but I was hardening, my spine straightening, my heart clawing its way back to life. Evidence piled up like kindling, receipts for dinners I never tasted, tucked into his coat pockets, hotel charges for conferences in cities he never mentioned. I didn't confront him. I scanned each one, stored them in a locked folder on my laptop, and logged them in my notebook, each entry a brick in my fortress. When he said, "You'd be nothing without me, you can't even sync the thermostat," I nodded, poured his sparkling water, and thought not anymore. Our home's silence wasn't calm. It was a bowstring drawn tight, quivering with tension. One night, I woke from a nightmare of his voice. "You'll have nothing." I sat up, heart thundering, sweat beading on my brow, and a fierce whisper answered, "Wrong." I had the document, the proof, and time, a currency I'd learned to wield. In Lena's office, under the flicker of a dying fluorescent bulb, I handed her the post-nup. She read it, her glasses slipping, her fingers tracing the lines. "This is a guillotine," she said, tapping the paper with a reverence that made my chest tighten. "He handed you the blade?" I wrung my hands, my nails digging into my palms. "I don't want blood. I want freedom." She nodded, her jaw set, and drafted an addendum, locking in asset splits, 70% of his investments, the cottage, the car, securing support, all tied to Julian's careless signature. She handed me a USB drive, a printed copy, and a look that screamed, "You're unstoppable." That night, I ironed Julian's shirts, laughed at his tax anecdotes, and polished the silver for Christmas, each fork gleaming like a promise. He didn't see the storm I was brewing, the quiet forging of a weapon sharper than his words. Julian grew reckless, his arrogance a fire fed by my silence. He left his phone unlocked, texts flashing from unsaved numbers. One read, "She's blind. Filing on Christmas. You in?" I screenshot it, emailed it to my private account, and erased it from his phone, my fingers steady, my pulse even. He came home to warm focaccia and my warmest smile, the kind I'd perfected over years of swallowing his barbs. At a neighborhood potluck, the backyard strung with fairy lights, Marcus grinned at Julian over a plate of roasted zucchini. "She'd collapse without you, man. You've got her tamed." I arranged figs on a platter, their purple skins gleaming, my hands unshaken, and smiled as Julian's arm slid around my waist, his touch possessive but empty. "You're stunning tonight," he said, his voice smooth as glass. "Thank you, darling," I replied, my tone velvet over steel, my heart a furnace. I recorded his calls, the ones where he laughed too hard, confessed too much, his voice slurring with overconfidence. My planner filled with symbols, a slash for late nights, a circle for lies, a star for unexplained charges on our joint account, a $300 dinner here, a $500 hotel there. To Julian, it was a chore list, scribbled with grocery notes. To me, it was a war map, each mark a step toward liberation. I became his shadow, reflecting the wife he wanted. Quiet, breakable, predictable. He left cash on the counter, crisp hundreds with no explanation, took client trips with suits heavy with cologne, and once I found a receipt for an emerald bracelet I'd never seen, tucked into his briefcase. I logged it, noting the shade, Forest Whisper, a name that felt like a taunt. 2 weeks before Christmas, I found the final piece. Julian, loose from too many sparkling waters at a client dinner, left his phone open on the couch, its screen glowing in the dark. A text from Marcus. She won't see it coming. Christmas, front row seats. Attached was a gif of a woman sobbing into a tissue, her mascara streaking. I screenshot it, emailed it to my private account, and deleted it, my fingers steady as stone. That night, lying beside him, his snores filling the room, I stared at the ceiling, my mind a blade honed to perfection. He thought he'd scripted my ruin, a grand finale to his control. I'd written my resurrection, and it was coming. Christmas Eve burned with a deceptive warmth. The dining room was a tableau of holiday cheer, candles dancing on the mantel, their flames casting shadows across the pine wreath above the hearth, a roasted chicken gleaming on a platter, its skin crisp and golden. Lena passed her garlic mashed potatoes, her toddler giggling as he smeared sauce on his cheeks. My parents swapped stories about their hiking club, their voices warm with nostalgia, while Julian's brother, Theo, teased his wife, Clara, about her endless knitting projects. Julian wore the forest green sweater I'd bought him last year, its while catching the candlelight, his smile as polished as the silverware. He carved the chicken with a showman's grin, winking at me across the table, his hazel eyes glinting with something darker, anticipation, maybe, or triumph. I smiled back, my pulse a steady drum, my hands unshaken. Tonight was mine, and I was ready. "Best meal yet, Elise," my dad said, raising his glass of sparkling cider, his weathered hand steady. "You've mastered this." Julian nodded, his smile smug, his fork poised above his plate. "She's had years to practice. 10th Christmas, right?" His voice carried that lilt, the one that hit a barb beneath its warmth. 11th, I corrected, my tone soft as falling snow, my eyes locked on his. He raised his glass, the liquid catching the light. "To 11 more, or however long we last." Laughter rippled around the table, but I heard the venom, the cruel edge no one else caught. I chuckled, brushing my napkin across my lap, my heart roaring like a wildfire. Tonight, tonight, tonight. The meal unfolded in a haze of clinking glasses and murmured compliments. My mother praised the cranberry relish, its tartness cutting through the richness of the meal. Theo told a story about a disastrous camping trip, his wife rolling her eyes but laughing. Lena's toddler knocked over a glass, and we all scrambled to mop up the spill, the chaos a brief reprieve from the tension coiling inside me. Julian played the perfect host, refilling glasses, cracking jokes, his charm a polished mask. But I saw the glances he exchanged with Marcus, seated at the table's end, his smirk barely concealed behind his cider glass. They were waiting, poised for the moment they thought would break me. As dessert loomed, apple tart and cheesecake cooling on the counter, Julian stood, tapping his glass with a butter knife, the chime cutting through the chatter. "A little gift for my wife," he said, his voice smooth, his smile wide and expectant. He slid a plain white envelope across the table, its edges crisp, unadorned by ribbon or card. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes glassy with anticipation, his lips twitching. The room stilled, forks pausing, breaths held. "Merry Christmas, love," Julian said, his tone dripping with false affection. I opened the envelope slowly, my face a mask of calm, my fingers steady despite the storm inside me. Inside was a petition for dissolution of marriage, signed, filed, the pages highlighted in yellow, as if he'd marked his victory in advance. I met his gaze, his eyes gleaming with the confidence of a man who thought he'd already won, and I smiled, a fierce, unyielding smile that made his brow twitch. "Thank you," I said, my voice a quiet inferno, each word laced with a strength he'd never seen. His smile faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. Marcus shifted in his seat, his smirk wavering. I reached into my purse, pulled out a sleek fountain pen, its silver body cool against my palm, and signed the papers with one fluid stroke, the ink flowing like a river breaking free. I slid the envelope back across the table, though it smooth under my fingers. "Done." Julian blinked, his confidence cracking like thin ice. "That's it?" he asked, his voice too light, too casual, as if he could still control the script. "That's it," I echoed, my tone steady, my eyes locked on his. Then I reached under the table, lifting a silver-wrapped box, its ribbon catching the firelight like a blade. "Your gift," I said, placing it before him, my voice calm but heavy with intent. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the wrapping, then tore it open, revealing a leather portfolio, its surface smooth and black as night. He opened it, and the moment he saw the first line, his face drained of color, his breath catching. Inside was the post-nup, dated, notarized, a fortress of my making, its clauses ironclad, its terms unyielding. His fingers tightened on the paper, his knuckles white, as he read and reread the document that bore his own signature, the one he'd scrawled in a drunken haze, thinking it a joke. "What is this?" Marcus asked, leaning in, his voice sharp with unease. Julian didn't speak, his eyes glued to the pages, so I did. "It's the agreement he signed last year," I said, my voice raw, gripping, unfiltered, each word a hammer striking stone. "Updated, filed, binding." I filed first. The room froze, the air thick with the weight of realization. Lena's eyes blazed with pride, her lips curving into a faint, fierce smile. Julian's mother gripped her scarf, her knuckles pale, her breath shallow. Theo's wife, Clara, stared, her fork suspended midair. "You agreed to every term," I continued, my voice steady, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Assets, support, the cottage, the investments, you signed it." Marcus's jaw dropped, his cider glass forgotten. "No way!" Theo cut in, his voice soft but urgent. "You okay, man?" Julian's eyes stayed on the document, his mind racing for a loophole, a crack, an escape that didn't exist. I reached into my purse again, my movements deliberate, and placed a small, cream-colored envelope beside the portfolio. He opened it, his hands trembling, and pulled out a sonogram, its edges soft, its image stark, a grainy outline of life, of hope, of a future he couldn't control. "I'm pregnant," I said, my voice a visceral pulse, each word heavy with unapologetic truth. 12 weeks. His face shattered, shock, then a fleeting warmth, a flicker of something human, drowned by a tidal wave of panic. Postnup, pregnancy, assets, custody, the weight of his own arrogance crashed down, crushing the illusion he'd built. "You planned this," he whispered, his voice raw, barely audible, his eyes wide with a fear I'd never seen. I met his gaze, unapologetic, my heart laid bare, its strength a fire that burned through his lies. "You bet I'd cry," I said, my voice low but steady, each word a blow. "You called me predictable. I didn't plan, I prepared." The silence was heavy, electric, a payoff that hit like a tsunami, washing away years of his control in a single, devastating moment. I sipped my cider, the cloves sharp on my tongue, their bite grounding me, and stood to clear the dessert plates, my movements calm, deliberate. Apple tart or cheesecake? I asked the table, my voice light, as if I hadn't just dismantled an empire. No one answered. Julian sat, the portfolio and sonogram before him, his world crumbling under the weight of his own signature. Lena squeezed my hand under the table, her touch a lifeline, her thumb warm against my skin. Marcus looked away, his smirk buried, his shoulders hunched. Julian's mother stared at her plate, her earrings still, her breath uneven. Theo's eyes darted between us, his face pale. I wasn't broken. I was reborn, fierce, unstoppable, my heart pounding with a strength I'd forgotten I owned. Julian shoved his chair back, the legs screeching across the pine floor, a sound like a wounded animal. "You think you've won," he said, his voice low, trembling with a mix of anger and fear. I didn't answer. He didn't deserve one. He stormed out, the front door slamming, the sound echoing through the cottage like a final chord. Lena leaned close, her breath warm against my ear, and whispered, "I always hated that sweater." Laughter broke through, raw and warm, a release of unfiltered heart that filled the room. My mother chuckled behind her napkin, her eyes shining with something like awe. Clara let out a nervous giggle, then clapped a hand over her mouth. I took a bite of apple tart, the fruit bright, the crust warm, and smiled. Not for him, not for show, but for me, a visceral triumph that tasted sweeter than any dessert. Lena stayed that night, her presence a quiet anchor. "You're not waking up alone," she said, her voice firm, her eyes soft. We slept in the guest room, its quilt heavy with the scent of lavender, her hand brushing mine in the dark. By morning, Julian was gone, no note, no keys, just silence, the kind that felt like freedom. I made breakfast, the kettle's whistle sharp in the quiet house, the scent of coffee filling the air. The locksmith arrived by noon, a gentle man with kind eyes who changed the locks without questions. I handed him Julian's old keys, their metal cold in my palm. "Make sure these don't work," I said, my voice steady. When he left, I stood in the foyer, a new key in my hand, its weight a promise, the first thing I'd owned alone in years. Julian's mail piled up. Bills, overdue notices, demands stamped in red. I stacked them neatly on a side table, unforwarded, their weight a reminder of his unraveling. Lena called that evening, her voice electric, bubbling with a glee she didn't bother to hide. "His lawyer's flailing," she said, her words quick, sharp. "You've got 75% of his assets. Investments, the cottage, the car, and with the baby, he's facing support payments he can't dodge. He's already trying to backtrack, but the post-nup's airtight." I smiled, not for the money, but for the freedom, raw and gripping, a liberation that felt like breathing for the first time in years. "You're a force, Elise," she said, her voice softening. "Always were." I curled into my couch, the house smelling of sage and pine, the lake's reflection shimmering through the window, and whispered, "Thanks for staying." The fallout was quiet, like snow settling on the lake's edge. Some friends faded, their texts going silent, their allegiances shifting. Others sent cautious messages, careful not to take sides. One, from a college friend I hadn't seen in years, read, "You're a legend, Elise. Keep shining." A bouquet of irises arrived at my doorstep, their petals vibrant against the gray December sky. No card, just a note in neat script, at last. Julian's assistant, I guessed, a woman who'd seen his charm curdle long before I did. At his firm, his reputation soured. Whispers followed him through the halls. His name vanished from the partner track, his office relegated to a corner with a flickering bulb. He walked alone at lunch, his swagger gone, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his own mistakes. I bought new soap, its lavender scent filling the bathroom, a small rebellion against the unscented bars Julian preferred. I painted the nursery a soft coral, the brush stroke steady, each one a reclaiming of space. I hung moon-shaped lights above the crib, their glow warm against the walls. I hummed while cooking, danced barefoot across the kitchen floor, the pine creaking under my steps. One evening, I found our wedding album in the attic, its leather cover dusty, its pages heavy with memories that no longer fit. I didn't cry. I boxed it, labeled it done, and drove it to the donation center, the weight lifting as I handed it over. At the bookstore, I bought a journal, its pages thick and ivory, its leather cover soft under my fingers. I titled the first page mine and wrote nightly, dreams of a future I could shape, truths I'd buried, plans that belonged only to me. When my son kicked, I was slicing pears in the kitchen, Nina Simone's voice curling through the air like smoke. The flutter stopped me cold, my hands flying to my belly, tears falling before I could stop them. It wasn't just a kick, it was a vow, unapologetic and fierce, a promise that this child would never know a home that quaked with tension, never mistake fear for love. I wrote in my journal that night, my pen pressing hard into the page, "He'll grow up in a house of warmth, of laughter, of love that doesn't cut." Lena moved in during my third trimester, her suitcases thumping against the stairs, her laughter filling the cottage like sunlight. She worked remotely from the dining table, her laptop surrounded by mugs of tea, her fuzzy socks bright against the pine floor. "I'm not letting you do this alone," she said, her eyes fierce but warm. "Besides, someone's got to stop you from eating pickles with ice cream." We fell into a rhythm, painting the nursery, cooking soups that simmered for hours, dreaming up names. Elliot, Rowan, Sage, each one a seed of hope. The nursery bloomed slowly, a sanctuary of my own making. I thrifted a rocking chair, its wood worn but sturdy, and refinished it with a soft white stain. I hung shelves, their edges lined with books I'd read to my son. Stories of dragons, of forests, of heroes who didn't need to shout to be strong. A stuffed fox sat in the corner, its amber eyes glinting in the moonlight. Lena and I laughed over her attempts to assemble a crib, the instructions scattered across the floor, her curses muffled by giggles. "This is your villain origin story," she declared, tossing a screwdriver aside. We laughed until our sides ached, the sound echoing through the cottage, a reminder that joy could live here again. Christmas came again, the table smaller, cozier, alive with unfiltered heart. Lena's toddler, now a whirlwind of curls and sticky fingers, spilled cranberry sauce on the tablecloth, crowing with delight. My parents laughed over old stories, hikes gone wrong, recipes they botched in their early years. I held my son, his tiny hands gripping my finger, his eyes wide and curious, a shade of hazel that reminded me of my own father, not Julian. The high chair gleamed, new and sturdy, its wood polished to a warm shine. Lena brought a new friend, a quiet woman with a sharp wit who fit into our chaos like she'd always been there. We passed plates of roasted vegetables, mashed potatoes, and apple tart, the air thick with the scent of cinnamon and pine. I didn't watch the door. I didn't brace for jabs. I didn't rehearse responses in my head. I was here, whole, present, the payoff visceral, a triumph that pulsed through every breath. After dinner, I sat by the fire, my son asleep on my chest, his breath soft and warm against my sweater. The flames crackled, casting shadows across the room, their dance a quiet celebration. Lena handed me a mug of cocoa, its steam curling upward, and sat beside me, her shoulder brushing mine. "Merry Christmas," she whispered, her voice soft but heavy with meaning. I kissed my son's forehead, his skin warm and smooth, and murmured, "He said I'd be nothing. Turns out I'm everything." The months that followed were a slow rebuilding, each day a brick in a new foundation. I started painting again, my canvases bold with color, crimsons, golds, blues that spilled like emotions I'd bottled too long. I rejoined the poetry group, reading verses that made my voice tremble but my heart soar. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and quiet smiles, their support a silent acknowledgement of what I'd overcome. Lena stayed until my son was 3 months old, her laughter a constant, her presence a shield. When she moved out, she left a note on the kitchen counter, "You're the strongest person I know. Call me when you need me." I framed it, hung it in the nursery, a reminder of the family I'd chosen. Julian's absence became a gift. His firm demoted him, his name erased from the letterhead. Colleagues who once laughed at his jokes now avoided his gaze. His lawyer sent letters, each one more desperate, but Lena handled them with a precision that made me smile. The post upheld, its clauses a cage of his own making. I used the settlement to secure the cottage, to fund a college account for my son, to buy a new easel that stood proudly in the living room. I planted a garden in the backyard, its beds filled with lavender and sunflowers, there blooms a defiance of the gray winters I'd endured. One spring evening, I saw Julian on Church Street, his coat too heavy for the season, his shoulders hunched as he spoke into his phone, his voice sharp with frustration. He didn't see me, or maybe he did and couldn't bear to meet my eyes. I kept walking, my son in his stroller, his babbling a melody that drowned out the past. Later, Lena sent a screenshot, a memo from Julian's firm, his name absent from the annual report. I replied with a single heart emoji, then made tea, the steam rising like a prayer. My son, Elliot, grew strong, his laughter filling the cottage like music. He'd reach for the fox in the nursery, his tiny hands grasping, his eyes bright with wonder. I'd read to him at night, my voice steady, the words weaving a world where he'd never know fear disguised as love. The cottage became a haven, its walls no longer echoing with Julian's jabs but with the sounds of life. Elliot's giggles, Lena's visits, my own humming as I painted. I bought new sheets, white with tiny gold stars, and slept diagonally across the bed, the space mine alone. I lit candles after dinner, their flames a quiet rebellion, and drank tea in the bay window, watching the lake shimmer under the moon. The first time Elliot said Mama, I was kneading dough in the kitchen, flour dusting my hands, Billie Holiday's voice soft in the background. The word stopped me, my breath catching, tears spilling over before I could blink. It wasn't just a word, it was a tether, a reminder that I was enough, that I was everything. I wrote in my journal that night, my pen flying across the page, he'll grow up knowing love that lifts, not love that cuts. He'll know a mother who fought, who rose, who won. The words felt like a vow, unapologetic and fierce, a promise to myself and to him. Years later, I tell Elliot stories, not of Julian, not of the pain, but of the strength that carried us through. I tell him about the silver box, the moment I turned the tables, the night I reclaimed my life. I tell him about the cottage, the nursery, the garden, the laughter that grew where silence once lived. And I tell him about the key, the one I held in the foyer, its weight a symbol of everything I'd built, everything I'd become. If this story's unapologetic emotional punch, raw intensity, unfiltered heart, and visceral payoff struck you, smash that like button. My favorite moment, sliding that silver box across the table, watching Julian's world fracture under the weight of his own arrogance. What was yours? Share in the comments. For more stories of resilience and triumph, subscribe and hit the bell. You won't miss a heartbeat.